Morning. Oh, we've only got about half of our class so far. Give everybody a few minutes. Here comes Hayward. What was I just on? Okay, we don't have Ian. We don't have Corey. We don't have Brendan or Troy. I feel like that almost rhymes. It's like a slant rhyme. Here comes Troy. Okay, folks. Hopefully we'll have another couple people join us, but we'll see. Absent, absent, absent. Also, oftentimes, as soon as I put in absent, they'll show up. Okay. So today, basically, is going to be story time. We don't have an assignment to go with this story. We're just going to talk about it afterwards. I'm certainly willing to let someone read if they want to, but also I'm fine if you guys just want me to read to you like we're in kindergarten. I loved story time in kindergarten, obviously. Your story is published on Canvas. It's called The Ebony Frame. And it's a weird story. I'm going to pull it up and I'll share my screen with you guys once I have it up. But also, obviously, you can have your own copy open. What did I do with it? The Ebony Frame. It looks like it's sort of long because it's 12 pages, but if you look at it, it's not that long. Like the margins are really wide and it's not actually very long. I like kindergarten too. I miss it. So easy. And you got dinosaur stickers for being able to count. It's very cool. Okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Everybody should be able to see this. Anybody want to read? No. Okay, oh, here comes Corey. Yay. Sorry, I'm just letting him in. Okay. What was I about to say? Oh, as we're reading this, just kind of keep in mind what a lot of the Gothic things are that we looked at yesterday, like the double or doppelganger, the uncanny, certain settings. You guys can go back and look at all the Gothic conventions that we looked at yesterday, but kind of be thinking about if you notice any of those things, if you notice any romantic stuff, because obviously there's a big overlap in the Venn diagram of Gothic stuff and romantic stuff, because Gothic is just an offshoot of Romanticism. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to ask you about it afterwards. Okay, The Ebony Frame by, I didn't put the author's name on this. I can't remember. We'll find it afterwards. Okay. This is an interesting story. I just read this for the first time this year. But even though it's like a little bit old timey, it's interesting. It's not, and it's like not hard to read, not hard to understand. To be rich is a luxurious sensation, the more so when you've plumbed the depths of hard-upness as a Fleet Street hack, a picker-up of unconsidered pars, a reporter, an unappreciated journalist, all callings utterly inconsistent with one's family feeling and one's direct descent from the Dukes of Picardy, I don't know. So this narrator is someone who like came from a good family, but he is sort of like down on his luck. He's an unappreciated journalist, so like not really living the super rich fancy life. When my Aunt Dorcas died and left me $700 a year in a furnished house in Chelsea, I felt that life had nothing left to offer except immediate possession of the legacy. If even Mildred Mayhew, whom I had hitherto regarded as my life's light, became less luminous. I was not engaged to Mildred, but I lodged with her mother, and I sang duets with Mildred and gave her gloves when it would run to it, which was seldom. She was a dear, good girl, and I meant to marry her someday. It's very nice to feel that a good little woman is thinking of you. Good little woman. It helps you in your work, and it's pleasant to know that she will say yes when you say, will you? But as I say, my legacy almost put Mildred out of my head, especially as she was staying with friends in the country just then. Before the first gloss was off my new mourning his aunt who has passed on her legacy or like her estate to him. I was seated in my aunt's own armchair in front of the fire in the dining room of my own house. My own house. It was grand, but rather lonely. I did think of Mildred just then. The room was comfortably furnished with oak and leather. On the walls hung a few fairly good oil paintings, but the space above the mantelpiece was disfigured by an exceedingly bad print, The Trial of Lord William Russell, framed in a dark frame. I got up to look at it. I had visited my aunt with dutiful regularity, but I never remembered seeing this frame before. It was not intended for a print, but for an oil painting. It was a fine ebony, beautifully and curiously carved. Here we have the name of the story. I looked at it with growing interest, and when my aunt's housemaid, I had retained her modest staff of servants, came in with the lamp, I asked her how long the print had been there. Mistress only bought it 2 days before she was took ill, she said, but the frame, she didn't want to buy a new one, so she got this out of the attic. There's lots of curious old things there, sir. Had my aunt had this frame long? Oh, yes, sir, it come long before I did, and I've been here 7 years come Christmas. There was a picture in it, that's upstairs too, but it's that black and ugly, it might as well be a chimney back. Probably like chimney. My grandma sort of pronounced chimney like chimney. I felt a desire to see this picture. What if it were some priceless old master in which my aunt's eyes had only seen rubbish? Directly after breakfast next morning, I paid a visit to the lumber room. It was crammed with old furniture enough to stock a curiosity shop. All the house was furnished solidly in the early Victorian style, and in this room, everything not keeping with the drawing room suite ideal was stowed away. Tables of paper mache and mother of pearl, straight back chairs with twisted feet and faded needlework cushions, fire screens of old world design, oak bureau with brass handles, a little work table with its faded moth-eaten silk flutings hanging in disconsolate shreds. On these and the dust that covered them blazed the full daylight as I drew up the blinds. I promised myself a good time in re-enshrining these household gods in my parlor and promoting the Victorian suite to the attic. But at present, my business was to find the picture as black as the chimney back, and presently, behind a heap of hideous still life studies, I found it. Jane, the housemaid, identified it at once. I took it downstairs carefully and examined it. No subject, no color were distinguishable. There was a splotch of a darker tint in the middle, but whether it was a figure or a tree or house, no man could have told. It seemed to be painted on a very thick panel bound with leather. I decided to send it to one of those persons who pour on rotting family portraits the water of eternal youth. Mere soap and water, Mr. Besant tells us it is, but even as I did so, the thought occurred to me to try my own restorative hand at a corner of it. My bath sponge, soap, and nail brush, vigorously applied for a few seconds, showed me that there was no picture to clean. Bare oak presented itself to my persevering brush. I tried the other side, Jane watching me with indulgent interest. The same result. Then the truth dawned on me. Why was the panel so thick? I tore off the leather binding, and the panel divided and fell to the ground in a cloud of dust. There were two pictures. They had been nailed face to face. I leaned them against the wall, and the next moment I was leaning against it myself. So for some reason, these two portraits have been like stuck together and put in this frame and like intentionally so that nobody would find them or like be able to see what it was. So once he starts trying to like clean the frame, he realizes and tries to pull the pictures apart. For one of the pictures was myself, a perfect portrait, no shade of expression or turn of feature wanting. Myself in a cavalier dress, love locks and all. When had this been done, and how without my knowledge? Was this some whim of my aunt's? Would be kind of weird to like see a like an oil portrait of yourself that you don't remember anyone ever painting and just like randomly find it in your aunt's attic. It'd be a little creepy. Lord, sir, was the shrill surprise of Jane at my elbow. What a lovely photo it is. Was it a fancy ball, sir? Yes, I stammered. I don't think I want anything more now. You can go. She went, and I turned, still with my heart beating violently, to the other picture. This was a woman of the type of beauty beloved of Burne-Jones and Rossetti. Straight nose, low brow, full lips, thin hands, large, deep, luminous eyes. She wore a black velvet gown. It was a full-length portrait. Her arms rested on a table beside her and her head on her hands, but her face was turned full forward and her eyes met those of the spectator bewilderingly. On the table by her were compasses and instruments whose uses I did not know, books, a goblet, and a miscellaneous heap of papers and pens. I saw all this afterwards. I believe it was a quarter of an hour before I could turn my eyes away from hers. I've never seen any other eyes like hers. They appealed as a child's or a dog's do. They commanded as might those of an empress. Shall I sweep up the dust, sir? Curiosity had brought Jane back. I acceded. I turned from her my portrait. I kept between her and the woman in the black velvet. When I was alone again, I tore down the Trial of Lord William Russell, and I put the picture of the woman in its strong ebony frame. Then I wrote to a frame maker for a frame for my portrait. It had so long lived face to face with this beautiful witch that I had not the heart to banish it from her presence, from which it will be perceived that I am by nature a somewhat sentimental person. The new frame came, and I hung it opposite the fireplace. An exhaustive search among my aunt's papers showed no explanation of the portrait of myself, no history of the portrait of the woman with the wonderful eyes. I only learned that all the furniture together had come to my aunt at the death of my great uncle, the head of the family. And I should have concluded that the resemblance was only a family one if everyone who came in had not exclaimed at the speaking likeness. I adopted Jane's fancy ball explanation. So he doesn't remember getting this portrait made of him, and he's like, well, maybe it was like my great uncle or some other family member that just looks a lot like me. But literally everybody who sees this painting is like, that's you. That's like, there's no argument to be made. That's definitely you. So he just kind of brushes it off and is like, oh yeah, I was taken at a fancy ball, whatever. And there one might suppose the matter of the portraits ended. One might suppose it, that is, if there were not evidently a good deal more written here about it. However, to me, the matter seemed ended. I went to see Mildred. I invited her and her mother to come and stay with me. I rather avoided glancing at the picture in the ebony frame. I could not forget, nor remember without singular emotion, the look in the eyes of that woman when mine first met them. I shrank from meeting that look again. So he's like kind of obsessed with this woman in the portrait, even though he has no idea who it might be. I reorganized the house somewhat, preparing for Mildred's visit. I turned the dining room into a drawing room. I brought down much of the old-fashioned furniture, and after a long day of arranging and rearranging, I sat down before the fire, and lying back in a pleasant languor, I idly raised my eyes to the picture. I met her dark, deep hazel eyes, and once more my gaze was held fixed as by a strong magic, the kind of fascination that keeps one sometimes staring for whole minutes into one's own eyes in the glass. I gazed into her eyes and felt my own dilate, pricked with a smart like the smart of tears. Spoiler alert, this is where the story really changes. I wish, I said, oh, how I wish you were a woman and not a picture. Come down, come down. I laughed at myself as I spoke, but even as I laughed, I held out my arms. I was not sleepy. I was not drunk. I was as wide awake and as sober as ever was a man in this world. And yet, as I held out my arms, I saw the eyes of the picture dilate, her lips tremble. If I were to be hanged for saying it, it's true. Her hands moved slightly, and a sort of flicker of a smile passed over her face. I sprang to my feet. This won't do, I said, still aloud. Firelight does play strange tricks. I'll have the lamp. I pulled myself together and made for the bell. My hand was on it when I heard a sound behind me and turned, the bell still unrung. The fire had burned low and the corners of the room were deeply shadowed, but surely there. Behind the tall work chair was something darker than a shadow. I must face this out, I said, or I shall never be able to face myself again. I left the bell. I seized the poker and battered the dull coals to a blaze. Then I stepped back resolutely and looked up at the picture. The ebony frame was empty. From the shadow of the work chair came a silken rustle, and out of the shadow the woman of the picture was coming towards me. I hope I shall never again know a moment of terror so blank and absolute. I could not have moved or spoken to save my life. Either all the known laws of nature were nothing, or I was mad. I stood trembling, but I am thankful to remember I stood still while the black velvet gown swept across the hearth rug towards me. This is kind of scary. Like, obviously, we're not like shaking on our boots about it, but it kind of reminds me of, if you guys have seen It Chapter 1, which most of you probably have, there's like a scene where Stan, one of the kids, like goes into his attic and there's like a creepy portrait, much scarier than this portrait of this woman, and it kind of like comes out of the frame a little bit, and it's like terrifying. I think that's one of the scariest parts of the movie, because the image is scary, and then also the idea of like something being able to come out of a portrait is terrifying. No, it's part one when they're kids, and it's showing how like Pennywise kind of like presented himself to all the different kids as something different. Those are some of my favorite movies too. I love those movies. Ba, 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 ba. Oh, Sterling, you got to see part 2. Bill Hader plays Richie. I don't know if you guys know how much I love Bill Hader, but he's my favorite. I love him so much. And all the other guys are good too. Like the guy that plays grown-up Eddie is so like, he gets it down. Like it's a perfect representation of what that kid would be like grown up. Anyway, this woman is coming out of the portrait towards him. Next moment, a hand touched me, a hand soft, warm, and human, and a low voice said, "You called me, I am here." At that touch and that voice, the world seemed to give a sort of bewildering half turn. I hardly know how to express it, but at once it seemed not awful, not even unusual, for portraits to become flesh, only most natural, most right, most unspeakably fortunate. Not scared anymore. He's just like, cool, I'm glad this woman's out of this portrait. This is super normal. I laid my hand on hers. I looked from her to my portrait. I could not see it in the firelight. "We are not strangers," I said. Oh no, not strangers. Those luminous eyes were looking up into mine. Those red lips were near me. With a passionate cry, a sense of having suddenly recovered life's one great good that had seemed wholly lost, I clasped her in my arms. She was no ghost. She was a woman, the only woman in the world. "How long?" I said. "Oh, love, how long since I lost you?" She leaned back, hanging her full weight on the hands that were clasped behind my head. "How can I tell how long? There is no time in hell," she answered. Weird thing to say. So like he's totally normal, like he's fine about this, even though she, like, what is she? The fact that she says there's no time in hell kind of makes it seem like maybe she was dead, maybe she was in hell, I don't know, but they seem like they just automatically accept the fact that like we have known each other before, like we are in love, and now we have to just like connect the dots and figure out how we got to this point. Why don't I remember you? It was not a dream. Ah, no, there are no such dreams. I wish to God there could be. When in dreams do I see her eyes, hear her voice, feel her lips against my cheek, hold her hands to my lips as I did that night, the supreme night of my life. At first we hardly spoke. It seemed enough, after long grief and pain, to feel the arms of my true love round me once again. I'm guessing this is a quote from like a famous song or poem, since it's kind of like set off in quotation marks, and pain and again rhyme. It is very difficult to tell this story. There are no words to express the sense of glad reunion, the complete realization of every hope and dream of a life that came upon me as I sat with my hand in hers and looked into her eyes. How could it have been a dream when I left her sitting in the straight back chair and went down to the kitchen to tell the maids I should want nothing more, that I was busy and did not wish to be disturbed, when I fetched wood for the fire with my own hands, and bringing it in found her still sitting there, Saw the little brown head turn as I entered, saw the love in her dear eyes, when I threw myself at her feet and blessed the day I was born, since life had given me this. Not a thought of Mildred. Oh, poor Mildred. All the other things in my life were a dream. This, it's one splendid reality. I'm wondering, she said after a while, when we had made such cheer each of the other, as true lovers may after long parting. It's phrased weird. I'm wondering how much you remember of our past. I remember nothing, I said. Oh, my dear lady, my dear sweetheart, I remember nothing but that I love you, that I have loved you all my life. You remember nothing? Really nothing? Only that I am yours, that we've both suffered, that tell me, my mistress dear, all that you remember. Explain it to me. Make me understand. And yet, no, I don't want to understand. It is enough that we are together. If it was a dream, why have I never dreamed it again? She leaned down towards me. Her arm lay on my neck and drew my head till it rested on her shoulder. I am a ghost, I suppose, she said, laughing softly. A little weird way to say it. And her laughter stirred memories which I just grasped at and just missed. But you and I know better, don't we? I'll tell you everything that you have forgotten. We loved each other. Ah, no, you have not forgotten that. And when you came back from the war, we were to be married. Our pictures were painted before you went away. You know I was more learned than women of that day. Dear one, when you were gone, they said I was a witch. They tried me. They said I should be burned just because I had looked at the stars and had gained more knowledge than they. They must needs bind me to a stake and let me be eaten by the fire, and you far away. Her whole body trembled and shrank. Oh, love, what dream would have told me that my kisses would soothe even that memory? The night before, she went on, the devil did come to me. Oh, man. I was innocent before. You know it, don't you? And even then my sin was for you, because of the exceeding love I bore you. The devil came and I sold my soul to eternal flame. But I got a good price. I got the right to come back through my picture if anyone looking at it wished for me, as long as my picture stayed in its ebony frame. That frame was not carved by man's hand. I got the right to come back to you. Oh, my heart's heart, and another thing I won, which you shall hear anon. They burned me for a witch. They made me suffer hell on earth. Those faces, all crowding around, the crackling wood and the smell of the smoke. Oh, love, no more, no more. When my mother sat that night before my picture, she wept and cried, come back, my poor lost child. And I went to her with glad leaps of heart, sorry. Dear, she shrank from me, she fled, she shrieked and moaned of ghosts. She had our pictures covered from sight and put again in the ebony frame. She had promised me my picture should always stay there. Oh, here comes Ian. Should always stay there. All through all those years, your face was against mine. So this is pretty messed up, or like it got very dark very fast. Like they loved each other once upon a time, and like who knows when that was. And he left to go to war, and she got accused of being a witch. And then the devil came to her and was like, hey, you can stay in this picture frame and like come back if anybody wishes for you, as long as you give me your soul. She was like, all right. So it's quite a deal there. She paused. But the man you loved, you came home. My picture was gone. They lied to you and you married another woman. But someday I knew you would walk the world again and that I should find you. So this is super weird because it's almost like a time travel ghost romance, which is definitely like pretty, like that's a lot going on for a story during this time period. They had been in love, like presumably in some other life, but she was like, oh, I can wait on him because he will walk the world again. So I guess they think that, reincarnation's a thing or something. And that she'd be able to see him again then. Super weird. The other gain, I asked. The other gain, she said slowly, I gave my soul for. It is this: if you also will give up your hopes of heaven, I can remain a woman, I can move in your world, I can be your wife. Oh, my dear, after all these years at last. If I sacrifice my soul, I said slowly, with no thought of the imbecility of such talk in our so-called 19th century. If I sacrifice my soul, I win you. Why, love, it's a contradiction in terms. You are my soul. Her eyes looked straight into mine. Whatever might happen, whatever did happen, whatever may happen, our two souls in that moment met and became one. Then you deliberately choose to give up your hopes of heaven for me as I gave up mine for you. I decline, I said, to give up my hope of heaven on any terms. Do you Tell me what I must do that you and I may make our heaven here, as now, my dear love. I will tell you tomorrow, she said. Be alone here tomorrow night. 12 is ghost time, isn't it? As the old adage goes. And then I will come out of the picture and never go back to it. I shall live with you and die and be buried, and there will be an end of me. But we shall live first, my heart's heart. I laid my head on her knee. A strange drowsiness overcame me. Holding her hand against my cheek, I lost consciousness. When I awoke, the gray November dawn was glimmering, ghost-like, through the uncurtained window. My head was pillowed on my arm, which rested, I raised my head quickly, not on my lady's knee, but on the needlework cushion of the straight-back chair. I sprang to my feet. I was stiff with cold and dazed with dreams, but I turned my eyes on the picture. There she sat, my lady, my dear love. I held out my arms, but the passionate cry I would have uttered died on my lips. She had said 12 o'clock. Her lightest word was my law, so I only stood in front of the picture and gazed into those gray-green eyes till tears of passionate happiness filled my own. Oh, my dear, how shall I pass the hours till I hold you again? She's planned to meet her at midnight. No thought then of my whole life's completion and consummation being a dream. I staggered up to my room, fell across my bed, and slept heavily and dreamlessly. When I awoke, it was high noon. Mildred and her mother were coming to lunch. I remembered at one shock Mildred's coming and her existence. Now, indeed, the dream began. With a penetrating sense of the futility of any action apart from her, I gave the necessary orders for the reception of my guests. When Mildred and her mother came, I received them with cordiality, but my genial phrases all seemed to be someone else's. My voice sounded like an echo. My heart was otherwhere. I've never heard that phrase that way, otherwhere. Still, the situation was not intolerable until the hour when the afternoon tea was served in the drawing room. Mildred and her mother kept the conversational pot boiling with a profusion of genteel commonplaces, and I bore it as one can bear mild purgatories when one is inside of heaven. I looked up at my sweetheart in the ebony frame, and I felt that anything might happen, any irresponsible imbecility, any bathos, I don't know that word, of boredom, was nothing if after it all she came to me again. And yet, when Mildred too looked at the portrait and said, "What a fine lady, one of your flames, Mr. Devine," I had a sickening sense of impotent irritation, which became absolute torture when Mildred, how could I have ever admired that chocolate box barmaid style of prettiness? That sounds like a real big burn, right? Chocolate box barmaid style of prettiness. Like, I don't quite know what it means, but it sounds like a big insult. Threw herself into the high-back chair, covering the needlework with her ridiculous flounces, and added, "Silence gives consent. Who is it, Mr. Devine? Tell us all about her. I'm sure she has a story." Poor little Mildred, sitting there smiling, serene in her confidence that her every word charmed me, sitting there with her rather pinched waist, her rather tight boots, her rather vulgar voice, sitting in the chair where my dear lady had sat when she told me her story. I could not bear it. "Don't sit there," I said. "It's not comfortable." But the girl would not be warned. With a laugh that set every nerve in my body vibrating with annoyance, she said, "Oh dear, mustn't I even sit in the same chair as your velvet-back woman?" What does that mean, Troy? Your pouch? Looks like a tied knot and a monkey is standing on it. Okay. I don't understand it, but sounds like a burn. I looked at the chair in the picture. It was the same, and in her chair, Mildred was sitting. Then a horrible sense of the reality of Mildred came upon me. Was all this a reality after all? But for fortunate chance, might Mildred have occupied not only her chair, but her place in my life? I rose. So he's kind of thinking like, was all this stuff with the woman in the portrait a dream? This is what feels like the dream, me with Mildred, because I feel so much more strongly towards this ghost portrait lady. And it's almost like I'm watching somebody else go through the motions of my normal everyday life. And he's like really honestly thankful that this happened, because he's like, wow, I would have just like married Mildred and she sucks in comparison to the ghost portrait lady. I'll check that later. I hope you won't think me very rude, I said, but I am obliged to go out. I forget what appointment I alleged. The lie came readily enough. I faced Mildred's pouts with the hope that she and her mother would not wait dinner for me. I fled. In another minute, I was safe, alone, under the chill, cloudy autumn sky, free to think of my dear lady. I walked for hours along streets and squares. I lived over again and again, every look, word, and hand touch, every kiss. I was completely unspeakably happy. Mildred was utterly forgotten. My lady of the ebony frame filled my heart and soul and spirit. You should probably find out her name. As I heard 11 boom through the fog, I turned and went home. When I got to my street, I found a crowd surging through it, a strong red light filling the air. A house was on fire, mine. I elbowed my way through the crowd. The picture of my lady, that at least I could save. All right. As I sprang up the steps, I saw, as in a dream, yes, all this was really dreamlike. I saw Mildred leaning out of the first floor window, wringing her hands. Come back, sir, cried a fireman. We'll get the young lady out right enough. But my lady? I went on up the stairs, cracking, smoking, and hot as hell, to the room where her picture was. Strange to say, I only felt that the picture was a thing we should like to look on through the long, glad, wedded life that was to be ours. I never thought of it as being one with her. As I reached the first floor, I felt arms round my neck. The smoke was too thick for me to distinguish features. Save me, a voice whispered. I clasped a figure in my arms and with a strange dis-ease bore it down the shaking stairs and out into safety. It was Mildred. I knew that directly I clasped her. Stand back, cried the crowd. Everyone's safe, cried a fireman. The flames leaped from every window. The sky grew redder and redder. I sprang from the hands that would have held me. I leaped up the steps. I crawled up the stairs. Suddenly, the whole horror of the situation came on me. As long as my picture remains in the ebony frame, what if picture and frame perish together? I fought with the fire and with my own choking inability to fight with it. I pushed on. I must save my picture. I reached the drawing room. As I sprang in, I saw my lady, I swear it, through the smoke and the flames, hold out her arms to me who came too late to save her and to save my own life's joy. I never saw her again. Before I could reach her or cry out to her, I felt the floor yield beneath my feet and I fell into the fiery hell below. How did they save me? What does that matter? They saved me somehow. Curse them. Every stick of my aunt's furniture was destroyed. My friends pointed out that as the furniture was heavily insured, the carelessness of a nightly studious housemaid had done me no harm. No harm. That was how I won and lost my only love. I deny with all my soul in the denial that it was a dream. There are no such dreams. Dreams of longing and pain there are plenty, but dreams of complete, of unspeakable happiness, no, it is the rest of life that is the dream. But if I think that, why have I married Mildred and grown stout and dull and prosperous? I tell you, it is all this that is the dream. My dear lady is the only reality. And what does it matter what one does in a dream? The end. It's kind of a sad story, to be honest. Okay, so thinking about the things we looked at yesterday, which I'm just going to quickly open my.
I have almost no idea what just happened.
Well, it's weird. It's a weird story. And like the character kind of doesn't know everything that happened because he was like, was this real? Was it like, is it a dream? What part of it is a dream? So, long story short, if I were to sum up this story, this dude finds a portrait of himself and a woman and like immediately falls in love with the portrait of the woman, and even though he's quasi engaged to marry someone else. And as he's like falling asleep, he's like, oh, I wish you could come out of that portrait and be with me. And then she does, and she was like, you may not remember when like in another life you and I were in love and we're supposed to be married, and then you went to war, and then I got burned for being a witch, and I sold my soul to Satan so that I could come out of this portrait as a ghost. And if you also sell your soul to Satan, or like some version of that, then I could come out of the portrait for good and be a woman and stay with you. And he was like, hey, that sounds good. I'll sell my soul to Satan. And then before he can do that, the house catches on fire and the portrait is burned, and he winds up marrying Mildred. And the whole time he's like, I don't really know if that was a dream. I feel like it wasn't. In fact, I feel like that was the only thing that really mattered. That was the only reality that really mattered. But here I am with my dumb wife, Mildred. And it's sort of like, it's kind of an ambiguous ending. Like, did he dream it? Did he not? Um, so the things that
It's a very unsatisfying story.
it is very unsatisfying. I agree.
There's
Like, they're not satisfied, and we're not satisfied with them.
there's absolutely no catharsis at all. There's none.
There's none. I know it's kind of messed up. Although sometimes I like an ending like that, like a sort of ambiguous and like, what was this all for? Um, but with this one, it's just kind of unsatisfying. There's this movie that just came out, Promising Young Woman, which is pretty adult. I don't know that I would like recommend it to you guys, but um, a lot of people have talked about the ending because it's kind of tied up too neatly in a way.
Excuse me, teachers. At this time, we will begin our fire drill. At this time, we will begin our fire drill. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sure that, like, I know I shouldn't have said anything about this, but before I continue talking about that, if we were here and having a fire drill, like if part of you were here, the hybrid situation, we would not actually go we would not like go outside of the building for a fire drill. You would stay here and I would tell you where to walk. And if you're in my class, we would walk down this stairwell that's like right beside the bathrooms and then just go directly outside. That's our fire drill for today. Yeah, but that movie, a lot of people complain about the ending because in some ways it's like wrapped up too cleanly and it's almost like too satisfying. And I wish that it had not been like as cleanly wrapped up because I think it would have been more realistic. So with a situation like that, I can understand some like ambiguity or like maybe an ending not being super satisfying. But with this one, I agree. I kind of just I don't like it. There's not any catharsis here, right? So the things that we looked at yesterday, we talked about like the wilderness or like outside being representative of like mystery or maybe even some like darker or like more sinister things. We talked about dark versus light. We talked about the double or doppelganger, where there could be like a twin or an alter ego of another character. We talked about liminality, which is like a transitional place or space or time or person or character. The uncanny, when the familiar becomes unfamiliar in like an unsettling way. We talked about moral or physical degeneration, like a downward spiral. We talked about family and like things, like things happening across the span of time. How man is inherently evil, and we talked about the grotesque, and we talked about masks. Can you see any of that in this story? I can definitely think of a couple, so I'm wondering if you guys can kind of point any out. No?
I missed what the question was.
If any of the Gothic conventions that we talked about yesterday, which you might have seen from the notes, I know that you missed when we actually went over them, but any of those things, do you see examples of those things in the story? I'm going to go ahead and point out one that I think is maybe not reaching exactly, but it just might not be as easy to identify as some. We talked about like the wilderness or like the woods or the frontier or something being representative of like a more sinister place or like mysterious. You can get away with things there. And while it's not exactly like wilderness or woods or anything, I kind of thought about that when when the portrait lady was talking about how she got called a witch or got accused of being a witch because she learned a lot about the stars. And if you're just like spending a lot of time outdoors, like studying the stars, while that's not exactly wilderness, it's also like outside of normal life, normal civilization. So I think that would be a good example. Um, I told you guys yesterday the uncanny is a thing that's like kind of hard to explain, but I did give you the examples of like that's why dolls are creepy, because they look like us but they're not. I talked about the black swan example where she's like seeing her reflection do a different thing than her face is doing. Can you guys see any examples of the uncanny in this story?
I was gonna say that I had thought of like, um, I think just from what I understand, a big part of Gothic literature is like blurring the lines between what is real and what is not. And this is just absolutely riddled with that. It's everywhere.
Yes, exactly. That's a great point. And that kind of liminality was the word that we used. And you're right, it's everywhere in this story. The fact that he's like not sure what's a dream and what's real, that's one of the examples we talked about, where like when you're on that transition between being asleep and being awake, you're like, what was that a dream? Did that actually happen? And he's kind of like living in that space right now. The lady, she's like kind of alive, but not exactly. And even she is like, I don't know, I guess I'm a ghost. So she's a liminal creature or character. Creature sounds weird, but um for sure, like this whole story is kind of about like what's real and what's not. Um, I was gonna say with the uncanny, the portrait that's like coming to life is a good example of the uncanny because it's normal to just look at portraits. It's normal to see a painting of someone, but when that painting starts to like move and change, that's definitely unsettling. Like you're looking at something that's fairly normal, but there's just something really not normal about it. Yeah, the nun, exactly. Okay. Um, okay, anything else? We only have a couple minutes left. Anything else that you guys noticed from this story? Let's see, what was the other one I thought of? Oh, kind of like it was under the family tab, but like repercussions of past actions can echo across time, even though that's dealing more with like um family and the way we like pay for our family's sins. I think that's still applicable here because it's um like they had been in love previously, like maybe in another life, and now it's coming back around and they're having to deal with it again. Um, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys go. Tomorrow we're gonna do some review for our vocab quiz on Friday and introduce a new thing that could potentially be fun. So I'll see you guys tomorrow.
We should do story times more often. This was fun.
Okay. All right. I'll take that into consideration. See ya.
We should read the books Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Oh my gosh, I love Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I have 2 of the 3 volumes of it. Maybe
I have all.
a good. I bet there's something pretty gothic in there. So
I have the 3 books. I just need to find them, and I have the movie.
I saw the movie. I thought it was obviously not as good as the books, but that's par for the course.
Mhm.
All right. See you guys tomorrow.